The Attitude Era in WWE, then the WWF, is the most lauded period of any promotion in all of wrestling. Reaching an unprecedented level of popularity and having a cool factor about it not seen before or since. Simply put, there was never a better time to be a fan of the physical pantomime known as professional wrestling. A huge part of this was the shift in tone and direction in the business as a whole. Fringe Federation ECW had been pioneers of the more violent, edgy style of wrestling almost since its inception in the early 1990s, while Hulk Hogan's heel turn in rival promotion WCW and the subsequent emergence of the NWO brought about the era of the cool bad guy and less cartoony, more gritty storytelling. The WWF followed suit, and in 1997, Vince McMahon ushered in a new chapter for his promotion, calling it the Attitude Era, blurring the lines between the stereotypical good guys and bad guys, while giving a more cynical, desensitized 90s audience more sex and violence. This changed the whole presentation of the product. Chugging new metal riffs and warlike pyrotechnics now started off Raw as War on Monday nights. Wholesome characters like the aforementioned pre-heel Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior were replaced by renegade anarchists like Stone Cold Steve Austin and the fellatio-obsessed misfits like D-Generation X. These were performers that evolved with the times and the direction that the company was going in. This led to the creation of some of the greatest characters in the history of the business. Less gimmicky than what came before, with more latitude to push the boundaries than what we have now. This was the golden era for the cool face and the despicable heel. None of this would have mattered, however, if their in-ring performances were lackluster. Luckily, thanks to a greater than ever emphasis on athletic ability, the rise of new, more daring match types like the Hell in a Cell and TLC matches, and a hyper-competitive locker room atmosphere that brought out the best in its top performers, the WWF's roster during this period was at its peak in Between the Ropes and Out. Also, just a quick note, I'm going to be defining the Attitude Era from the December 15th episode of Raw, where Vince McMahon ushered in the era, to the end of WrestleMania X7 on April 1st, 2001. This ranking will be based not just on the quality of the wrestlers present on the list, but just as crucially, on their work and push during the era and the overall impact they had on this time specifically. Therefore, some terrific wrestlers will be excluded from this list. Wrestlers like Shawn Michaels, one of the greatest wrestlers who had a tremendous impact on the industry and many outstanding matches during his tenure, but the majority of which took place before the Attitude Era was really in full swing, and during his famous and lengthy comeback in 2002. Others like Eddie Guerrero or Chris Benoit who, in spite of being exceptionally talented, wouldn't receive their major push until the Attitude Era had come to an end. So, with all that said, join me as I rank the 10 greatest wrestlers from the Attitude Era. Number 10, The Big Show. When shortlisting all the wrestlers for this countdown, I took a number of different factors into consideration, such as the wrestler's presentation and gimmick, their skills on the mic, and the impact they had in the WWF at this time. If this list was based purely on in-ring ability, then there would be one or two individuals that might not have made the cut, with The Big Show most likely being the first on the chopping block. It's not that he was a bad wrestler, and he did take part in some pretty good matches during these 4 years. It's just that there were many other wrestlers that didn't make it onto this list that had a superior work rate in between the ropes than the at times two-dimensional big bruteness of The Big Show. So why did he make it on this list? Well, for one, he had one of the biggest presence on the show, no pun intended. Now, that may not seem like a qualifying factor for some people, but when you consider that wrestling is a soap opera with athletic elements and not a real athletic competition, then screen time, character, and where you place in the story are very important. And place he did. Within a year of being in the company, Show would go on to feud with superstars like The Rock, Triple H, and Mankind, tag team with locker room legend The Undertaker, win a multitude of WWE titles, including the main championship itself, a mere 9 months after debuting, and would even wrestle in the, albeit lackluster, main event of WrestleMania 2000 4 months after that. So while other wrestlers on this list may be better in-ring technicians, few other performers on the roster made a bigger impact than The Big Show. Number 9, Chyna. The only woman to feature on this list, Chyna is in many ways like a female version of The Big Show. While not possessing the same in-ring IQ or athletic gifts as many of her contemporaries, both male and female, Chyna stood out in the women's division by simply being way bigger, stronger, and more physically imposing than any of them. These attributes not only ensured that Chyna would crush almost any opponent of the same sex, but it made her a viable competitive threat to the men on the roster. Chyna was a trailblazer during a period which wasn't exactly stellar for female wrestling. She became the first woman to enter both the Men's Royal Rumble match and the King of the Ring tournaments in 1999, and she was also the first female to win a non-women's championship, beating Jeff Jarrett to become the coveted Intercontinental Champion in 1999. She would also go on to have a legitimate feud with some of the men on the roster, most notably Chris Jericho, which began in 1999. Like The Big Show, Chyna would attain the brunt of her success in 1999 and would begin to fade in the new millennium. She aligned herself with Eddie Guerrero in 2000, playing Mamacita to his Latino heat, and regressing into more of a managerial position. She would also go on to win the Women's Championship for the first time in 2001, demolishing Ivory at WrestleMania that saw off the Attitude Era in what would have been a dominating but ultimately pointless reign atop the division. Still, a key member of DX, a popular figure amongst the fans, and a record shatterer, it's difficult to deny Chyna her position in this top 10. Number 8. Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho was one of the few names on this list who had a great run across multiple eras. Still going strong today, had Y2J been given the push he eventually would receive earlier on in his WWF career, he may have featured higher on this list. Still, given a somewhat rocky start with the company and not winning the big one until 8 months after the Attitude Era came to an end, his accomplishments in many other departments are still very impressive. First of all, Jericho was a fan favourite from the moment he debuted in 1999. While initially pushed as a heel against Chyna, his charisma and athletic in-ring ability meant he was nigh on impossible to boo. Unlike the two previous people we've discussed, Jericho's first really good year in the company was the year 2000. Beginning as the holder of the IC title, he would go on to have two great feuds, both for the belt and not, against Chris Benoit and Kurt Angle, having some of the best matches with those two men at any given pay-per-view, including a near show saver at that year's mediocre WrestleMania, a show in which, it is rumoured, Chris Jericho was meant to be in the main event of, only to be booted out of it by a returning Mick Foley. He also had a short feud with top heel Triple H, even beating him for the WWF title on an episode of Raw, a decision that was reversed and forever stricken from the record, unfortunately. Y2J's near 2-year run during the Attitude Era showed him as the nearly formed megastar he was to become. A top talent with a great look who could go in the ring with anybody and was entertaining as hell on the mic. Number 7. Kane. Debuting right as the Attitude Era was beginning, there is no one on this list that had a better jump out of the starting gate than Kane. Interrupting the first ever Hell in a Cell match in history to attack brother and main event star The Undertaker, Kane had everything going for him. Firstly, he had an amazing look and presence, standing nearly 7 feet tall, well over 300 pounds of muscle, and donning a mask and intimidating red and black jumpsuit. Kane was also surprisingly agile for such a big man, combining drop kicks and top rope clotheslines with power moves like the choke slam and tombstone piledriver. His backstory was also great, putting him in the main event scene by proxy and providing him with a ton of momentum. The most amazing thing about Kane's run, however, was how he never held the WWF title once during the Attitude Era, or for a long time after that. Okay, he did beat Austin for the belt at the 1998 King of the Ring, but he also lost it back to Austin the very next night on Raw. Still, taking the belt off the biggest star in the company at this time is indicative of the dominant tendencies Kane would display over the next 3 years. Number 6. The Undertaker. Another wrestler here who straddled multiple eras with the WWE. The Undertaker's Attitude tenure is also a tale of two personas. In the beginning, Taker led the gothic, human-sacrificing faction, the Ministry, as one of the top heels in the company, evolving his Uncle Fester-esque initial gimmick into the satanic cult leader of the late 90s. The Undertaker character's darker, more sinister edge perfectly fit the times in which he now found himself, with antics like kidnapping the owner's daughter for a sacrificial ritual, garnering heat and angst-ridden approval from the fans. Amazingly, Taker also barely had a run with the top prize in the business, beating Austin for it in 1999's Over the Edge, before dropping it to him a short time later on Raw, mirroring his brother Kane's short run with the title. An injury in late 1999 put him on the shelf for half a year, and when he returned in the year 2000 at Judgment Day, he was barely recognisable. Dropping the gothic attire and entrance for a leather jacket, Harley Davidson, and Limp Bizkit entrance music, The Undertaker debuted the biker gimmick, which would see him through the remainder of the Attitude Era. Hated by many purists, personally I liked the biker gimmick and felt it was more in tune with the WWF's more realistic, fourth wall breaking approach to storytelling. He also had some really good matches at this time, finding himself in a bunch of pay-per-view title matches from mid-2000 onwards, but culminating in an absolutely great encounter with Triple H at WrestleMania X7, which, for my money, was better than their matches at both WrestleMania 27 and 28. But regardless of which character he was playing, The Undertaker was then, as he is now, one of the most important and beloved wrestlers in the industry. Number 5. Kurt Angle. Out of all the entries on this list, Kurt Angle had the shortest run in the Attitude Era WWF, being active for just over a year by the time of his fantastic match and technical mat wrestling clinic with Chris Benoit at WrestleMania X7. However, his rookie year in the WWF was absolutely ridiculous, second only to that of fellow amateur wrestler stud Brock Lesnar 3 years later. From his debut win over Shawn Stasiak at Survivor Series in 1999, Angle would, by October of the following year, win both the Intercontinental and European titles, holding both simultaneously at one point, referring to himself as the Euro Continental Champion, win the King of the Ring tournament, tag team with Edge and Christian, and have a slew of brilliant matches and rivalries with the likes of Chris Jericho, Triple H, and The Rock, culminating with a win over the latter, then the biggest active star on the roster, at No Mercy 2000. So why was a rookie given such a huge initial push? The first answer is a relatively predictable one for anyone who knows anything about Angle: his pedigree. An Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling, Angle possessed unparalleled athletic ability and had a lifetime of grappling at the highest level under his belt. Although this doesn't always directly translate to the art of choreographed pro wrestling, it became apparent immediately that Angle was a natural, having bouts on par with, and even better than, his contemporaries night after night within months of debuting. Often overshadowed by Angle's in-ring work was his character. Angle didn't only take to the craft like a duck to water, he developed fantastic and highly underrated skills on the mic also, playing the role of the smug, nerdy heel brilliantly. He cut great promos, often on his way to the ring, antagonizing the audience arrogantly with his three eyes: intensity, integrity, and intelligence. Like Chris Jericho, Angle's phenomenal run as a WWE competitor lasted across more than one era. However, it's arguable that Angle's goofy heel persona didn't peak until the months preceding the Attitude Era, with his ruthless heel persona not coming to the fore until years later. Similarly, Angle wrestled his best matches in the months and years after WrestleMania X7, including his 2001 feud against Austin, his tag team matches with Chris Benoit in 2002, and, best of all, his series of epic matches with Brock Lesnar in 2003, some of the best work in the company's history. Even still, I would argue that in spite of how green he was during this period, Angle was still one of the top in-ring performers while active on the roster at this time. Number 4. Triple H. When analysing the Attitude Era, there is a legitimate debate as to who the top babyface in the company was during that time. Well, realistically, which one of two obvious candidates was the biggest star in the industry, but more on them very, very soon. However, when posing the question of who was the biggest heel of the Attitude Era, one name stands head and shoulders above everybody else. The quintessential Attitude Era bad guy, Triple H defined the product from the enemy camp more than anyone else. Active on the WWF roster for 2 years before the era began, Triple H was a stable force in the Federation's mid-card and, like many wrestlers on this countdown, didn't get his big push until the year 1999 when, on the August 23rd edition of Raw, he defeated Mankind for his first world title. Things only progressed rapidly from there, and what Triple H would do over the next 12 months would solidify him as one of the top performers in the company, as well as far and away the top heel. Character-wise, his look was iconic, with slick back hair and classic wrestling trunks. His entrance was one of the best in the WWF, emphasising his ruthless persona. His formation of the McMahon-Helmsley faction, with the remnants of D-Generation X there as extra insurance, meant he always found a way to screw his babyface adversaries and weasel his own way to victory, making him a legitimately hated figure in the eyes of even the more jaded fan of the new millennium. Often criticised now for his in-ring work, Triple H's performances between the ropes during this time were actually consistently great, especially during the aforementioned 12-month reign, where he put on not only the best matches of his career, but some of the best matches of the era period, most notably against Mick Foley and The Rock in 2000, where he played the villain to perfection, retiring Foley and using his political clout to systematically destroy The Rock wherever possible. With the former, Triple H had 2 pay-per-view show-stealing bloodbaths, a street fight at that year's Royal Rumble, and a Hell in a Cell at No Way Out. He had numerous excellent encounters with the latter, playing title tag with him throughout 2000, ultimately dropping it to the Brahma Bull at that year's SummerSlam, and thus seeing out arguably the most impressive 12 months, both in terms of story and in-ring work, the era would see. Number 3, Mick Foley. Joining the WWF back in 1996, Foley may be one of the more limited performers on our list in terms of pure athletic ability and technical wrestling proficiency. However, he more than made up for these deficits with his hard-hitting, self-sacrificial in-ring style, the diversity of his character work, and his talented promo work. All throughout his career, Foley garnered a reputation for his ability to absorb tremendous amounts of punishment, so when he finally arrived in the WWF, debuting as the deranged, mask-wearing lunatic Mankind, he developed this into a niche, which was as brutal on his own body to endure as it was exciting for the fans to watch. He would hone this devastating craft against multiple opponents, including The Undertaker, with whom he had a variety of harsh stipulation matches, including Buried Alive and Boiler Room Brawl matches as the company transitioned into the Attitude Era. His Hell in a Cell match with the Deadman at the 1998 King of the Ring would mark the peak of his self-abuse, with his falls off the top and through the cell setting a new standard of danger and brutality, which have never been quite matched even to this day. It also made Mankind a household name, and cemented his legacy as a quote-unquote hardcore legend of the wrestling business. Foley would go on to have other great matches in a similar vein, most notably with Triple H in a series of matches we touched on earlier, which were also some of the best work of Foley's career. However, Mick Foley had more to offer the craft than being a human punching bag like Mankind, or a barbed wire 2x4 wielding lunatic like Cactus Jack. His third character, or face, Dude Love, showed the geekier, more fun-loving side of Foley. Even more crucial though was the evolution of the Mankind character and, eventually, the exposure of Foley's own funny, ultra-charismatic personality. While it's true that in 1998 Mankind did a series of interviews with JR that fleshed out his character and displayed his exceptional promo skills, it was Mankind's more comedic 1999 work that would have the greatest impact on the company and on his career. After a series of crazy matches with The Rock, including a 1999 January episode of Raw where Mick won his first title, the moment often considered the catalyst for the shifting of the Monday Night Wars in the WWF's favour, Foley began to tone down the in-ring violence, focusing more on out-of-the-ring exploits to entertain the fans. Showing his comedic timing in interviews and promos, debuting Mr. Socko in the famous hospital scene with Mr. McMahon, teaming with and winning tag team gold with ex-nemesis The Rock, Foley was never more over with the fans in spite of taking far fewer and far less risky bumps. This switch was exemplified fully when, after his final match at WrestleMania 2000, one or two returns in later years notwithstanding, he returned to the WWF in the role of commissioner, not as Mankind, not as Cactus Jack, but just as pure Mick Foley, new haircut and all. Without a wrestling match, Foley was arguably more popular than he'd ever been as a competitor, thanks to hilarious segments with the likes of Edge and Christian, Kurt Angle, and even Triple H. What this meant was that, whether donning a mask and putting his life on the line in the ring, or donning a flannel shirt and making us laugh outside of it, Foley was one of the most vital and enduring performers of the Attitude Era. Number 2, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Considered by many the most important figure of the whole era, placing Austin in second place on this countdown is surely going to be controversial in the eyes of many. But rather than focusing on why he missed out on the top spot, as there'll be plenty of time to justify my number 1 pick, let's look at why Austin was such a pivotal wrestler in late 90s WWF. Coming into the WWF in 1995 as the ringmaster and protege of Ted DiBiase, Austin would shed the mediocre gimmick when, after defeating Jake the Snake Roberts at the 1996 King of the Ring, he delivered his now infamous Austin 3:16 says "I just whipped your ass" line, and thus the Stone Cold Steve Austin character was born. Given that this was over a year before any real tonal shift would begin, Austin should be looked upon as the proto-Attitude Era wrestler, the modern day face who fans cheer for in spite of his heelish tendencies. The more Austin attacked people, wrecked shit, drank beer, and used profanity on the job, the more the newer, edgier WWF fan cheered him, signifying that the days of the squeaky clean babyface like Hulk Hogan, who, himself ironically, was having a comparable impact on the industry in WCW as recently turned heel and leader of the NWO, was old hat. Austin solidified his status as the top bad boy babyface in the company in a submission match at WrestleMania 13 against Bret Hart. Completing one of the only truly successful double turn matches in history, a bloodied Austin refused to tap the Hart sharpshooter, who himself, enraged at Austin's conduct leading up to the match and the fans' approval of his actions, refused to let go, turning heel in the process and establishing Austin as the next big babyface in the process. As the Attitude Era began, a number of pivotal things happened that would catapult Austin from a mere fan favourite and into superstardom, as far and away the most popular performer in the industry. After the infamous Montreal Screwjob in November of '97, Vince McMahon became a de facto heel in the eyes of the fans, right or wrong, which is itself a topic for another video. But rather than shy away from the audience's disdain, Vince embraced it, creating the Mr. McMahon character, the tyrannical boss who ruled over his employees with an iron fist. 4 months later at WrestleMania 14, Austin beat Shawn Michaels for the WWF title, and with Michaels taking 4 years off with a debilitating back injury directly afterwards, Austin became the man. However, Austin was himself also battling serious injury as a result of a botched piledriver at the hands of Owen Hart at SummerSlam 1997. From that day on, Austin would unfortunately never perform in the ring at the same consistency night in and night out for the remainder of his 6-year career. However, with the new anarchic anti-hero Austin now the biggest star in the industry, McMahon had the perfect foil for all his evil plans. Thus spawned the McMahon-Austin feud which, although taking place mostly outside of the ring or in the form of one-sided, non-sanctioned beatdowns, would in many ways define the era more than any other in the industry. Austin's limited ability in the ring due to injury, and McMahon's natural lack of ability, meant that both had to rely on their character work to keep the fans engaged. This meant that on any given night, Austin would get a bigger crowd reaction charging to the ring at the end of Raw to administer a stunner to McMahon and drink a half a dozen Budweisers in under 5 minutes than all the other performers on the card who actually wrestled. Austin's entire persona, his iconic pop-inducing entrance music, his shaven head and studded vest, and his anti-authoritarian attitude and liberal use of profanity was just that over. Now that's not to say that Austin didn't perform between the ropes. In fact, when he was cleared to wrestle, Austin still had some phenomenal matches during this time. His feud with The Rock, which began during the Attitude Era's inception in late 1997 over the Intercontinental Championship, and culminated with their match and Austin's heel turn at WrestleMania X7, produced some of the best matches of the era, most notably their clashes at WrestleMania 15 and the aforementioned X7, arguably both men's finest match. He also had long-running programs with the likes of The Undertaker and Triple H, including an absolute barn burner of a 3 Stages of Hell match with the latter at No Way Out 2001. All in all, if there was one man who could be credited with spawning the Attitude Era, it would be the beer-swilling, finger-gesturing, Texas rattlesnake, Stone Cold Steve Austin. However, with all that said, it's time to reveal our number 1 wrestler of the Attitude Era. Number 1, The Rock. Let's just get this out of the way. Most lists would probably have the Bionic Redneck in at number 1. As I said earlier, Stone Cold had attitude before McMahon found a way to market it. And in the era's earliest days, no wrestler was more over than Austin. No one got a bigger pop, no one shifted more merch. So then, why do I have The Rock here as the greatest wrestler of the Attitude Era and not Austin? The reason for The Rock's placing on this list are, like every other entry thus far, multiple. But if I had to boil it down to one justifiable synopsis in light of our previous entry, it would be this. On his best day, the Brahma Bull did everything the Texas Rattlesnake did, just a little bit better, albeit a little bit later. The era, which literally ended with these two facing against each other at WrestleMania X7, saw their careers both interject together while following their own independent trajectory. Austin won his first WWF title in 1998 at WrestleMania. Rock captured it 8 months later at that year's Survivor Series. Austin headlined his first WrestleMania, the aforementioned WrestleMania 14. Rock followed suit a year later in 1999, headlining it with Austin. Austin won his first Royal Rumble in 1997. Rock won it in 2000. From November 1997 to April 2001, both men's paths crossed multiple times. First feuding for the Intercontinental title in late 1997, as we've already discussed. Then for the WWF title beginning January 1999, culminating at that year's WrestleMania. Both men would face each other 2 years later when Austin, winning his third Royal Rumble, would face The Rock yet again at WrestleMania. So, how do we separate these two giants of the industry? First, let's look at character. We've already concluded that the Stone Cold character was Austin's biggest asset, especially given his sporadic inactivity due to injury. And it's true, the Attitude Era's early days belonged to Austin, the undisputed biggest star in wrestling. And this popularity was what saw him dethrone the legend Shawn Michaels in 1998. But by 1999, this was a contested title, with the Brahma Bull's popularity skyrocketing. At the turn of the century though, The Rock was the biggest star in wrestling, a star that would see him transition the squared circle to become a cultural icon. So, how did he do it? And why do I assert that The Rock's character as a whole was better than Austin? On a purely superficial level, Rocky just had a better look. Like it or not, wrestling is a looks business, and Dwayne Johnson has this in spades. Also, nobody in the history of the business could have better promo than The Rock, and this includes Austin. Simply put, the Great One was just a far better talker than Austin, and captivated audiences in a way the Bionic Redneck never could. At the height of his powers, The Rock had the audience in the palm of his hand. He could make them laugh and whip them up into a frenzy with equal fervour, and they would finish his collection of brilliant and memorable catchphrases for him every night, even when he was a heel. Speaking of which, Rocky was able to play the villain and the hero with equal proficiency. His heel runs as the leader of the nation and the corporate champion were great. The former saw him turn the crowd's disdain of his earlier Rocky Maivia character on the crowd themselves, cutting savage promos on them and his adversaries. While the latter saw him exude so much of his charm and charisma that the fans cheered him anyway, meaning that the WWF had no choice but to turn him face in response. As good as his heel character was, it was his runs as a face that would make The Rock in the eyes of wrestling fans and, eventually, the world as a whole. From mid-1999 to the era's end, The Rock was simply a force of nature, and could shake the rafters of arenas the world over by simply standing silently on the turnbuckle or in front of the camera, gazing into the distance. The best talker in the business didn't even have to say or do anything to drive audiences insane. His aura was just that powerful. When Austin was written off television for a year at the 1999 Survivor Series to have neck surgery, The Rock had to carry the ball for the WWF. This was a period of unprecedented popularity and growth for the company, and this success could be largely attributed to The Rock, whose appearances on late night television and compact discs helped them make the WWF a viable commodity for all people to consume, not just the hardcore fringe of wrestling fans. Now, don't get me wrong, Austin did the same thing in the late 90s and was instrumental in making it cool, but he just didn't have the same star power that The Rock had, which has seen Johnson achieve massive success in all facets of the entertainment industry. And like it or not, these same qualities are vital in getting a character over in wrestling, and during this era, The Rock was more over than anyone. Now, if this list was based purely on in-ring ability, I would argue, perhaps controversially, that neither The Rock nor Stone Cold would occupy the number 1 or 2 slots. In terms of wrestling skill and athleticism, earlier entries like Jericho and Angle, and unranked newbies like Guerrero and Benoit would probably be more viable candidates. That being said, for me, The Rock was just slightly better between the ropes than Austin. Now, don't get me wrong, both Rock and Stone Cold were exceptional wrestlers, but a pro wrestler is not a competitive athlete, otherwise Mick Foley wouldn't be anywhere near this list. A pro wrestler's currency is determined by their work between the ropes, but only partially. Looks, personality, character development, psychology and presentation are equally important when tallying up their overall value. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off on another long tangent there. I guess the long and short of what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to actually having to get in the ring, this is just another facet of the game that The Rock played a little bit better than Austin. Bigger, more agile, and more athletic than the Bionic Redneck, Rocky threw crisper punches and executed moves more smoothly and was just a step quicker than Austin. The Rock also had more than his fair share of classics between the ropes. Without needing to retread old ground discussing his matches with Stone Cold, Rocky had amazing showdowns with Mick Foley, Triple H, Kurt Angle, The Undertaker, among others, putting on consistently great matches with the absolute best performers and biggest names the company had to offer. At the beginning of this list, I touched on the fundamental question of what makes a great wrestler. For me, a great wrestler has to be able to captivate an audience, be skilled on the mic, have a great look, or, at the very least, a distinctive one, be presented correctly, i.e. good entrance music, appropriate wardrobe, and, of course, be a good wrestler between the ropes. The Rock had all of these qualities in spades, and, for me, shined the brightest in a crowded locker room full of stars in one of the best and most prosperous eras in the industry.